Olá, seja bem-vindo. É um prazer ter a sua companhia para mais um programa Pertinente da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, dedicado a entrevistas a grandes personalidades internacionais ligadas à economia, sociedade e política. Hoje vamos falar de solidão, isolamento e saúde mental, temas cruciais, tendo em conta o facto da nossa vida ter mudado tanto socialmente durante a pandemia do Covid-19 e o tempo que passámos em casa sem podermos estar com amigos e família e termos também as interações normais de trabalho na escola. Vamos falar sobre o impacto do teletrabalho, da telescola na vida dos humanos, todos nós espalhados por este mundo e mais isolados relativamente àquilo que estamos habituados. Vamos também falar na expectativa de vida e abordar o tema se o isolamento e a solidão podem mudar a expectativa de vida e também a qualidade de vida. Vamos fazê-lo com uma perita em psicologia e neurociência, chama-se Julianne Holt-Lunstad, da Universidade Brigham Young University, no estado de Utah, nos Estados Unidos. E vamos começar aqui a nossa conversa com a Julianne. Greetings from Lisbon, Portugal. An absolute pleasure and privilege to be speaking with you today about this topic, which is so important, especially considering what's happened with our lives over the last 2 years and the COVID-19 pandemic, the fact that we have been more alone and more isolated than ever before, at least since technology as well was part of our everyday life. Let's get going with a pretty basic question, I think, Julianne. What has happened in the last 2 years to the human race in the way that all of a sudden most, if not all, of our social interactions that we had daily just ceased to exist? What do we know already about that period of time?
Right. Well, first of all, we already had good evidence that social isolation and loneliness had significant detrimental effects to mental health as well as physical health. And then suddenly, the entire population of the world had to limit their contact with others in order to limit the spread of this virus. And so, of course, everyone wanted to know to what extent this is increasing isolation and loneliness on a population level. And in fact, we have good data that there has been increases in loneliness. And in fact, while there were several studies that were done that just simply asked people their perceptions of, do you feel lonelier now than you did prior to the pandemic? And many of these showed indeed that people reported greater loneliness. But a number of studies actually happen to have data on individuals where they asked them the same questions prior to the pandemic and were able to follow these people up during the pandemic. And a recent meta-analysis of 32 of these longitudinal studies did indeed show that not only did the prevalence of loneliness increase over this time, but also there were increases in severity of loneliness during this time.
You've written extensively about the impact of loneliness and isolation on mental health and on quality of life and life expectation as well. First of all, I think it's also important to define isolation and loneliness. What is the difference? How would you describe it?
Yeah, that's really important because many of us will use the terms interchangeably. And this is because they often go hand in hand, but actually are distinct. And so isolation is thought to be more objective. It's objectively either being alone or having few relationships or infrequent social contact, whereas loneliness is much more of a subjective feeling of alone. It's a distressing feeling, but it's the described as the discrepancy between one's desired level of social connection and one's actual level of connection. And so typically when someone is objectively alone, you're more likely to feel alone. Mm-hmm. And that's why these can go hand in hand. But there are times when people are objectively isolated, but don't feel lonely. They might actually enjoy that time alone, that solitude. And conversely, there are times when people may not be isolated, but feel lonely. They may be surrounded by others. In fact, you may have heard the term, lonely in a crowd. And so you can still be surrounded by other people and yet still feel profoundly lonely.
What we did see over the last couple of years, and I do want to talk a little bit more about the effect of COVID before we talk about these issues in more general terms and moving forward, hopefully returning to normality and the impact that it usually has. But all of a sudden, we couldn't see our friends, we couldn't see our coworkers, students couldn't see their colleagues. How do you think, from your experience again, and looking at the way people were dealing with it around you and from other areas you studied, surely, how do you think the human race adapted to that, and what were the main issues that people were facing?
Right. So it's important to recognize that, first of all, humans are social beings. And so throughout human history, we've relied on other people for our survival. And so it's thought to be that we desire proximity to others and that this is adaptive to have proximity to others. And when we lack that proximity to others, of course, this feels distressing because this is a very threatening position to be in. And so many neuroscientists have argued that our brains have adapted to expect proximity to others. And so when we lack that proximity, that distressing feeling is almost like the biological drive similar to hunger and thirst. So just like hunger motivates us to seek out food and thirst motivates us to seek out water, that loneliness motivates us to seek out others and to connect to others. And so it's that distressing feeling, but that is adaptive. So first of all, I want to mention that distressing feeling is actually normal, and it's what's expected, and it's only when it becomes chronic that it becomes problematic. And so we've found ourselves in this very interesting position during the pandemic where it's as if we're all thirsty and being told that the water's not safe to drink. And so how do we adapt to this situation? And so, of course, many of us have turned to ways of connecting remotely. So whether that is, via texting or phone calls or video chats like we're doing right now. We've used these means of trying to connect at a distance. And then, of course, there's been means of connecting more in person that have meant to also been done to keep this at a safe distance. So having conversations with neighbors across a balcony or on a porch or from a doorstep. But we've tried to get creative in the ways in which we can maintain these connections to others. But it has gone on for quite some time now, and so I think many people, and we have evidence that some people have been able to cope better than others, and certainly some have been much more vulnerable during this time than others as well.
As far as social isolation, what can you tell us about the overall impact that it has not only on mental health, but on physical health as well? Because I think that's quite interesting.
Right. So there's good evidence that chronic isolation and loneliness puts us at increased risk for poorer mental health and physical health. And so, for instance, some of my research, we looked at global data prior to the pandemic and data that had followed people for an average of 7 years
Mm-hmm.
found that people who were lonely had a 26% increased risk of earlier death, and people who were isolated um, had a 29% increased risk for earlier death. So when
That's
experienced on a chronic
significant.
basis, yeah, this can actually reduce our lifespan and increase our risk of death from a variety of causes, including disease-related causes.
You also have written about in the past, and correct me if I'm wrong, that popular people live longer, and I thought that was an interesting finding or observation. Why do you think that is?
Well, so I want to make sure I'm clear about it. We don't necessarily use the term popular, but
Okay.
those who are more socially connected. And
Okay.
so
Thank
that
you.
can be in a variety of ways. So that can be either a large social network, but it also can include having people that you can rely upon. And that you feel are supportive, and so when measured in a variety of different ways, what we find is that those who are more socially connected have a 50% increased odds of survival relative to those who are less socially connected. And just to put this into perspective, when we benchmark this relative to other kinds of factors that influence our lifespan, we find that it is comparable and in many cases exceeds the effects of other kinds of factors that influence our lifespan. So for instance, when we benchmark this relative to smoking cessation, alcohol consumption, physical activity, flu vaccines, obesity, the magnitude of the effect that it has on our lifespan is comparable, if not exceeds some of these others. And so what this suggests is that our relationships have a strong effect on our, not only our well-being, but ultimately our health and longevity, and that we should really prioritize our relationships accordingly.
Yeah, and I imagine that also has something to do with how positive your relationships are and how you develop relationships around you, rather obviously positive relationships rather than toxic relationships or detrimental relationships that can also add stress and anguish to your everyday life, right? So it's not just the relationships, but the quality that you have as well.
Yeah, and that's correct. So other research that has examined conflict and strain and ambivalence in relationships show that can actually have a negative effect on our health. And so it really is, I guess I should say, very generally speaking, it's having more and better relationships that is healthy, but having fewer and poorer quality relationships can be associated with risk.
I wanted to talk about the impact of technology and social media. I mean, you mentioned obviously that it does help when you're alone, and I lived outside of Portugal for 2 decades, so I was away from my family a lot, and obviously we spoke on the phone, we texted, then with the advance of technology we had video calls, and that helped. But what I noticed these days is that virtual relationships are taking the time and space of physical relationships, and social media interaction is kind of taking the place of personal interaction. Do you agree? Do you think this is happening? And how do these virtual relationships and interactions compare with real physical interactions?
Yeah, so certainly we see the trends of these happening globally, and so there's no doubt that technology and remote means of connecting have increased and are being relied upon more heavily than ever before, and this is quite challenging in the sense that most of the decades of research evidence that has documented the effects on our well-being and on health and longevity are primarily based on in-person social contact. And so while certainly there is a flurry of research going on trying to understand the role of technology and how this is playing a role, we still don't have a good sense of how equivalent this is to in-person interaction. And it's hard because it's a very complex set of research, because there's so many different types of tools and applications and environments, and as well as the way in which they're used. And so it's really difficult to lump them all together and say they're all good or they're all bad, or they're all helpful or all unhelpful. And so I certainly want to make sure that people are aware that this is very complex. And also aware that there is some evidence to suggest that they aren't necessarily all helpful. And there have been some studies that have actually shown that some uses have been associated with greater loneliness. And so we just need to be very careful in not assuming that they are all helpful, and that we take this opportunity to critically evaluate the use of these tools, and so that we can harness those that are helpful and ways in which they are helpful, while also acknowledging and recognizing the ways in which they may potentially be detrimental and limiting those kinds of uses.
I wanted to make a comparison between the time I grew up and the time that my daughter will grow up. She's a baby now, and when I was hanging out with my friends, we were together. There were some phone calls, but we were together. Now, whether it's I'm not even going to talk about chat rooms, which are also something of the past, but whether that's group chats or video calls or again, social media interactions, is that is taking a little bit the place of physical contact. I mean, what can you tell us about the impact that this could have in future generations, where people all of a sudden think, well, I've texted so-and-so, I've video called so-and-so, so I don't need to be with them. And more you're interacting with people on a screen and less in person. I mean, from your experience and your expertise, what do you think can happen in this way that society is? I mean, we're more connected than ever electronically, but we seem to be having less time to actually sit down together and have a conversation, and a focused one as well, without it being interrupted 10 times by a message from someone else.
Right. And so on the one hand, there's these amazing advantages. Here I am in Utah in the United States, and you're in Portugal, and yet we're having this conversation. And so in that sense, it helps reduce the barriers of distance, and there may be ways in which we can connect to others that we are close to, where we can still feel a degree of emotional support. Those messages reaching out to you or to others, letting them know how much you care or are thinking about them, those things can certainly help facilitate a sense of feeling connected, feeling supported, and that there are those that you can rely upon. But there are certainly also limits to that, and that I think most of us can certainly relate to a time where we would have much rather been in person.
Mm-hmm.
And we certainly have evidence of even the importance of physical touch,
Mm-hmm.
of a hug, or any, physical affection, that these, which currently technology has, cannot replace, is that physical contact with others that is so important. But it can also introduce other means that may not necessarily be helpful either. So, for instance, on social media, it can facilitate a sense of feeling left out or excluded, because you suddenly are seeing others in your social network doing things without you, or a sense of social comparison, that everyone else's lives seem to be more exciting or more connected than your own, increasing that discrepancy between your desired level and actual level of connection, which is the defining feature of loneliness. And so there, and then you also mentioned, of course, the displacement factor. We may be spending so much time on our phones or devices or whatnot that it actually takes away from the time that we spend with those that we care about. And so there are many ways in which it can be both helpful and potentially detrimental. And so we really need to understand it and learn ways to use it more appropriately and in ways that can help us rather than potentially harm us.
Would you say that today's Western society is seeing more people spend more time alone and live more often alone? And what advice do you give to people who can be in isolation or may feel lonely in their everyday life? In a way, they want to be independent and have their own life and move away from the family, and but in another, obviously that creates other challenges. So what do you say to people who may be experiencing that and are spending more time alone?
Right. There is international data to suggest that the prevalence of those living alone has increased over the years.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is there has been some research during the pandemic that has shown that the pandemic has been particularly hard for those who are living alone. And in fact, a study that I published recently found that it was a multinational study. And what we found was that those who were living alone reported greater severity of loneliness compared to those who were living with others. But we were careful because we wanted to acknowledge that some people live alone by choice, while others would prefer not to live alone, but are regardless. And what we found was that that those who are living alone by choice still were 61% more likely to report severe loneliness compared to those who are living with others. But those who are living alone not by choice, who would prefer not to live alone, he reported 7 times greater, or they were 7 times more likely to report severe loneliness than those who live with others. Now, that's not to say that everyone who lives alone is lonely, but that there's an increased risk. And so those who are living alone, whether it be by choice or would prefer otherwise, certainly efforts to stay connected to those who are outside the home will be important, and that our coping responses can mitigate some of these effects. And so it just may take a little bit more effort among those who are living alone.
And Julianne, how important is it for people to admit that they're feeling lonely? And how important is it that their mental health is looked after and is taken care of in a serious way, whether that's initially by family and friends and then perhaps with a doctor? Because if something has happened over the last 2 years, at least from my point of view, is that at least the topic of mental health seems to be a lot more public or publicly debated. So how important is it that people admit they may be feeling a certain way to their physical and mental health overall?
Right. So as we've talked about, we have very good evidence of the detrimental effects of loneliness, including poor mental health, poor physical health, and poor cognitive health. But unfortunately, there's significant stigma associated with reporting that one is lonely. And so one of the things that I hope, one of the benefits or silver linings of the pandemic is that because every single one of us on a global scale has experienced this to some extent, that we all, first of all, know what it feels like and will hopefully have more compassion. But secondly, that because of this, we may be more open and willing to talk about it with others so that we can get the support that is needed. But one of the things I want to mention is that it's also so important to also think about how to help others. And that, in fact, we have evidence to suggest that actually one of the best ways to help yourself and reduce one's own loneliness is by helping others. And so by providing support to others, this can actually be associated with lower loneliness.
And without forcing you into kind of a coaching role here, to end on an inspirational note, what is some of your advice for people to live a fuller and a healthier existence from a social perspective and from a connection perspective?
Yeah, so I think I'd certainly like to just simply reiterate that it's important to recognize that loneliness is a normal part of human existence, and that it's okay to feel lonely in the moment. But when this starts to become something more chronic, that's the time when we need to get help. But as I mentioned, not only reaching out to get help for yourself, but to look out for ways to help others. And so one of the studies that I did during the pandemic is we asked participants to do small acts of kindness for those in their communities. And what we found was that those who performed these small acts of kindness were significantly associated with lower loneliness. And what this demonstrates is that one of the best ways that we can address this issue is not only helping others, but that this help can also in turn help ourselves.
That's really interesting, and there's an element of doing something to make someone else feel good, and by seeing them feel better, the impact that can have on your well-being as well, and that's key. And I think sometimes people forget that there are all kinds of opportunities to help, whether it's institutions, whether it's charities, whether it's any kind of movement or campaign that has people in need, and you feel more worthy as a citizen as well. Julianne, I wanted to ask you some quick fire questions here for us to close, which we ask all of our guests, and some of these obviously within the context of your work. So if you had one advice for us as a society when it comes to dealing with feeling lonely or isolated, what would that be?
I think I would go back to what I was just saying, is that that by helping and supporting others, that we can not only help reduce their loneliness, but potentially reduce our own.
If you could have one wish from a genie in a magic lamp, what would that be? What would you change?
I think at every level, we need to take this more seriously. So not just a personal level, but from an institutional level to even policy level, that we take relationships more seriously for our health, and that this is prioritized at a level commensurate with the evidence, and that just as we saw policies that certainly limited social contact, that there is the potential for policies that can instead facilitate social connection.
What is one personality trait that an effective leader or influencer should have, in your opinion?
Compassion.
That comes up a lot. And the biggest challenge that humanity is facing over the next decade, you would say?
Probably selfishness.
Yeah. And which then affects everything that you can talk about, whether that's the environment, whether that's taking care of ourselves and others. Selfishness is very much, or lack thereof, is very much at the center of that. Julianne, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you, to learn as well about this crucial topic for us as a human race, and to take it seriously as much as possible moving forward. More than certainly we have, and especially in certain cultures in the past, and continued success in your career and in your work, because it's definitely necessary to continue to study and interpret and lead in this area.
Oh, thank you so much.
Foi prazer falar com a Julianne, e eu posso dizer que aprendi imenso durante a nossa conversa sobre a solidão, o isolamento, o impacto que pode ter na nossa qualidade de vida, na expectativa de vida também, como as redes sociais influenciam ou não as nossas relações sociais, pessoais, o tempo que devemos tirar para estar uns com os outros e o impacto que isso pode também ter na nossa saúde, e o facto de nos ajudarmos uns aos outros, poder também batalhar, lutar contra algum sentimento de isolamento e de solidão que possamos sentir. Foi mais uma excelente conversa neste programa Pertinente da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos. Vemo-nos dentro em breve.